Alrighty, good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Good. Like I said, it's 4 o'clock on the afternoon, so appreciate y'all being here. My wife and I flew in from Houston this morning, and so I took a short nap in the afternoon just so I'd be, nice and fresh and energetic for you. And I was awoken by a brass band playing just outside. Now, I'm originally from Louisiana, so I wasn't upset at all about being woken up by a brass band. But that doesn't happen in Houston every day. Anyway, my name's Damon Small, and hopefully you're here to see what Infosec and oil and gas can teach us about Infosec in healthcare, because that's what I'm talking about. Before we jump into it, though, I want to give a special thanks, first of all, to NolaCon. Putting on a conference like this every year is very difficult. A lot of staff and volunteers put a lot of work into making this happen for us. So definitely thanks to them for doing that. My employer, NCC Group, I love my job. I love my employer. I get to do this as a part of my gig. So thanks to them for supporting me, being here to chat with you. And of course, my wife and editor. She has to, sitting up there in the front heckling me. She gets to see all these slides before you do, so she takes out all the bad bits and leaves in the good bits. So I think if you do public speaking or any kind of publication, make sure you have a good editor. And lastly, you, for showing up. As I mentioned, I have the great pleasure of doing quite a bit of public speaking, but I still remain terrified every time that literally no one is going to show up. So thank you for being here and making this worthwhile. As I mentioned, my employer is very great about supporting us, advocating for our industry, and coming out to speak. So you do have to sit through a short commercial. If you've not heard about NCC Group, we're based in the United Kingdom. We've got several offices here in North America, 35 offices globally, 2,000 consultants worldwide. So that's a lot of geeks. We do a lot of security services. We're a services-only organization. We don't sell products, but we do a lot of consulting. I show this slide because I'm hoping, notice I'm wearing the blue armband, I'm hoping to add Houston to that list under USA. That's where I'm based out of, working from home right now. We're hoping to add a brick-and-mortar office in Houston. So if you know any geeks that want to do consulting in Houston, Texas, please let me know, because we're trying to grow that location. All right, enough about them. Let's talk about me. Again, my name's Damon. I'm going to have to take that joke out. It never works. It is terrible. Technical Director for NCC Group North America. I've been in IT since 1995, and if you were around that time, you remember the dot-com bubble burst in around 2000, so that was a good time to kind of change directions of my career. So I started focusing on Infosec in 2001. Louisiana native, go Tigers. Any LSU fans? All right, go Tigers. Thank goodness. Yeah, that joke did not work in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Anyway, so yeah, no LSU fans up there. Been in Texas for about 22 years, but I love coming to NolaCon and coming back to my home state. Studied music at Louisiana State, crammed a 4-year degree into 5 years. It was wonderful. And then went to grad school. I'm a frustrated academic, so I just wanted to go to school, so I did. So mostly the first half of my career was really blue team Infosec. In Houston, the two largest industries are healthcare and oil and gas, so I've got a lot of experience working in those areas. Did some DoD work as well, and Johnson Space Center's down south of Houston, so I've done some work with Johnson as well. So that's me, and you can see it snowed in Houston not long ago, so I took a picture of me in my backyard with the snow on the fence there, and just coincidentally I was wearing my NolaCon hoodie, so that's the picture. All right. Give you a second to read that. So one of the benefits of being a consultant is that we get to exposed to a lot of different technical environments and different industries across different clients that we're working with. And so you see a lot of different ways to solve problems, some of which are very good and some are not so good. But that's why I have a job. So having spent those 10 years as a blue teamer, again, focused really heavily on oil and gas and healthcare, as a consultant over time I've noticed that there are some similarities between those two industries. And I should pause for a moment and ask, does anybody perchance work in healthcare in some capacity? Oh, wow. Okay, good. Oil and gas? Also some hands. Okay, cool. So my idea was that some of those similarities that I noticed were surprising to me. Perhaps they'll be surprising to you as well. And maybe by doing a bit of a transfer of knowledge from one of those verticals to the other, maybe we can help each other out and in trying to solve some of these problems that we'll talk about here in a minute. Oh, right, consulting. There are two tenets for being a successful consultant. If you are a consultant, maybe you know this. If you want to be a consultant, you need to know this as well. Number one, never tell the client everything you know. Okay, next slide. Get it? No, okay. That joke didn't work either. All right, so we to start off, we're talking about Infosec problems, which is sort of inherently a technical discussion, but actually I think we need to start at layer 8 or 9, which is the business of the problem. And I think a lot of business decisions and the way that these two vertical markets make business decisions has a lot of impact on how successful they are on solving the Infosec problems. So if you look at that first chart, it's a little difficult to see perhaps, but that the chart on the left is showing the price of crude oil over the years, and you can see it's fairly volatile. But the point is that entire vertical market exists selling a fungible good on a global market. So just, simple way to put it, they make a lot of money, or they do at times when oil is very expensive. Now the graphic on the right, that again, I apologize, I realize you probably can't see that, but there's a lot of very interesting statistics about the Texas Medical Center in Houston, which coincidentally is the largest medical center of its kind in the world. And they see, 10 million patients per year, it's the 8th largest employer in the state. Just a lot of amazing statistics that you look at. So you might wonder, okay, well, they should have a really good business too, at least in Houston. But despite all that, when you start looking at the business model, you realize that healthcare organizations, and the healthcare folks that are in here probably already know this, don't have a lot of control over how much you're paid for the services you offer, right? That's largely done by the payers, that is the insurance companies, and if it's an indigent patient, then you have to provide services and you may not get paid at all. So the first problem we realize is, the business model is quite a bit different. So how do we overcome that? We'll talk through that in a minute. One sort of example that I learned, and maybe some of you know this, certainly the oil and gas folks do, speaking of fungible goods in the oil industry, the gasoline that goes into a pipeline at any point in this country is the exact same gasoline, no matter who produced it, no matter who refined it. It's only when the gasoline comes out the other end of the pipeline and the additives are added by whatever the retail brand is that it becomes Exxon or Mobil or BP. Whoa! Wow, cool. All right. So that's just one of many examples of how the revenue stream for oil and gas is a lot different than healthcare. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage to say that I'm taking a very business-centric view of this problem. Another problem that we see, and again, hopefully this will resonate with the healthcare folks. Y'all know what Moore's Law is, right? Yeah. So every 18 months, capacitor density is going to double, and that, some people, that roughly equates to every year or so, processor speeds are going to get a lot faster. And that's been pretty consistent for a very, very long time. So the life cycle in technology, when we're talking about new devices that we're using, we're at a very, very fast moving scale. So for technologists, I don't know that I've ever owned a computer that was, older than 3 years old. Just because it's 3 years old, I've got to get rid of it and buy a new one because, the new ones are that much better. In healthcare, when you're talking about how old the technology is, as it turns out, there's a completely different frame of reference for time. I asked a doctor once how long it took for a new instrument to go from conception to, human testing to actually being used on patients, and he said, about 10 years. So in a healthcare organization's mind, when you're thinking about what a cycle of advancement of technology is, it's a decade. So saying, Moore's Law in 18 months, that is completely incongruent with what they're used to thinking of a life cycle to be. And this will start making sense, I promise. When you think about how often technology people say, hey, we've got to upgrade those servers, and then the business might say, they're only 7 years old. Why would we do that? As it turns out, there's reasons why the business doesn't view the world the same way that we do. And that's particularly evident in healthcare. And you could argue that that's the same in oil and gas as well. If you look at those peaks and valleys in the price of oil, some of those trends can take a very, very long time as well, right? Okay. So what I'm getting at, the first part of trying to help Infosec in either of these industries, frankly, is what you realize is that it's all based on spending decisions that the business is going to make before the information security team even gets to try and solve any problems, right? So what I've learned is that how organizationally you make those decisions and how much Infosec is involved in them is going to have a huge impact on how successful you're going to be. So it's not, or to put it a different way, not all systems are equal. I think a lot of organizations tend to say, okay, we're going to have an information security program, and here's our policies and procedures, and here's what we're going to do, and boom, you push that out across the entire organization. Well, like I said, not all systems are created equal, and if, we all manage our own household budgets, and we all know the idea that you should never spend more money protecting something than what that thing is worth, right? I had before I got rid of my old Expedition, I wouldn't carry expensive insurance on it because it wasn't worth anything. It's the same in IT and our information assets. Don't spend more than the asset is worth. Well, as it turns out, trying to figure out how much an information asset is worth is kind of tricky. Now, I'm happy to be wrong on this. Some people don't agree with me. My first point there, I say information has no intrinsic value. It might. Some people think it does, but I really think that the value of an information asset comes into play when you understand how it's applied or consumed. So it's not just a simple matter of oil and gas having more money, and yeah, it does sound crazy out there, doesn't it? Jeez, yeah, oh, good idea. Part of it, as it turns out, is oil and gas as an industry has gotten really good at this problem right here, which is trying to figure out how much an information asset is worth. So the first sort of case study I want to jump into here, it was an oil and gas company, and we were specifically talking about patching industrial control systems at a refinery. So if you deal with any sort of network operating system, it's got to be patched from time to time, right? And for the oil and gas folks, y'all probably know that industrial control systems are pretty tricky to deal with. So you can imagine, so of the oil and gas folks, anybody in IT and have to interface with the OT folks. Oh, my man. Yeah. All right, so you can imagine how this conversation went. This is a friend of mine that works at this oil and gas company, and IT rolled up to the refinery and said, surprise, we've got a new policy. Y'all got to patch those Windows boxes every month. Yeah, I'm still amazed that they weren't run over in the parking lot after that meeting by the OT folks. And the OT guy said, well, we could do that, but that requires a 4-hour outage of the control systems network every time we do that. And IT's like, yep, that's how IT works. That's what you do. And they're like, okay. So the refinery uses the telemetry from those control systems networks to optimize it so it runs at peak efficiency all the time. And refineries in this country are regularly at, 99% capacity? I mean, there's just not a ton of refineries sitting around. So OT explained to IT that 4-hour outage window, due to the loss of efficiency of those systems not being available, cost the organization $350,000 during that 4-hour outage window. So, that's pretty easy math to do, right? As an organization, if you want to save that $350,000, you can spend up to that amount of money in investing in other technical controls, because you're not going to patch every month. You might patch when you turn that refinery around every couple of years or so. But you can make a huge investment with that kind of money, knowing that there's other technical controls that can be put in place in lieu of applying the software patch. And that was a big moment for me when I heard that story, because I realized, that's where we're going wrong, because it's not the value of the computers or the infrastructure that supports the network or any of that, right? It's the value of the information asset. More precisely, it's what inefficiencies are introduced when that information asset is unavailable or incorrect or otherwise messed with. And it sounds kind of obvious when I say that out loud, and maybe you're all sitting there thinking, right, that's how you do it, but I've been amazed at how many clients, when I've talked them through that process, they've kind of been looking at valuating information assets in kind of not the best way. I don't want to say the wrong way, but I think that's the first thing we need to do, regardless of what industry you work in, is try and figure out how do we valuate those information assets. All right, great. So how much is enough? Well, if we know that we're going to lose $350,000 in 4 hours, well, that's a pretty good, place to start. I'll freely admit, as a consultant, I should say you should always spend more on your information security programs, particularly when you hire third parties, right? I mean, of course. But defense is hard. So now if we've convinced ourselves that we understand the value of our information assets, now we also have to understand the adversary. And the concept here is asymmetric warfare, right? I mean, you go to work every day and you're trying to protect your assets, and you've got to protect against all potential vulnerabilities and threat vectors that might exist, but the bad guy may have to be successful in exploiting but one, right? So you already know that if you're doing defense, your job is harder than the bad guy is. A hospital CEO once commented to me that he perceived the risk to his hospital system to be very, very low. And he said, we're just a regional hospital. Why would anyone care about hacking us? Well, the first part of the answer is that, a lot of malicious activity is indiscriminate, right? They don't know, if I'm a bad guy and I'm scanning the internet looking for vulnerable hosts, I'm not going to say, I better look up this, IP block to see who it belongs to. And if it belongs to, a not-for-profit hospital system, I'm going to leave them alone because they're doing a service to the to the community. Well, no, that's not how it works at all, is it? So all they care about is the availability of network-based resources that they have access to. It's interesting now, several years later, that healthcare organizations are actually becoming interesting targets. The NHS in the United Kingdom was virtually shut down for a very long time because so many large hospital systems there got attacked by ransomware. So in addition to understanding the value of your information assets, the other part of the problem is trying to figure out, okay, who is your adversary? And what is your actual threat model look like? And by the way, so that's a clever picture of a hockey goalie there, and he's one person standing in the crease in front of the net, and there's all those skaters out in front of him taking shots. So this is where I ask the audience: is this a clever metaphor for how hard defense is, or is it just really a thinly veiled opportunity for me to show you a picture of my son playing ice hockey? And the answer is it's a little of both, isn't it? So again, how much is enough? Sadly, the answer is that we're never going to truly catch up, right? I mean, the bad guys on some levels are always going to be ahead of us, I think. And to flip it back to oil and gas, I was trying to understand the context of a system that we were being asked to perform an assessment on, and I always asked, specific to that problem that I just described, who is your threat actor? Who are you worried about for this particular system? And without hesitating, he said NGOs. So I looked up NGO. It was on the phone, so he didn't see me do it. And those are non-government organizations. In this particular case, he was worried about environmental groups that were very interested in disrupting this exploration operation that was going on in eastern Russia. And that was a number of years ago, and I realized that trying to protect yourself against an advanced and very well-funded adversary like an NGO is a lot different than protecting yourself against a script kiddie that's just, running scans against random hosts, right? So I think that's another thing that we can help the healthcare industry in, is trying to understand that, all systems are not created equal, but all threats are not created equal as well. Another couple of similarities that I discovered, so we talked about OT and IT, and for those of y'all that are not, I apologize, I should have described that. OT is operational technology. Those are the people that manage SCADA systems and industrial control systems. IT, of course, is information technology. There's a lot of creative tension between those two teams because they have very different stresses, and those networks are managed in very, very different ways. As it turns out, you have the same thing in healthcare organization, where you have biomedical engineering teams that manage, the biomedical engineering devices, and those would be like radiological modalities like X-rays. It could be patient-delivered analgesics, the clicker, and it gives you drugs. Those networks are very similar because both ICS and biomedical are business and in some cases life critical. They're typically very highly specialized devices that might have off-the-shelf components, but they also have highly proprietary things in them. So when you have that mixture of specialized devices and specialized use cases with off-the-shelf components, you have a very interesting problem when you're trying to support them. Oil and gas is really good at describing those support models. Do y'all use for the oil and gas folks, do y'all use the Purdue model? It was developed, okay, right on, good. It's a model that describes things, and there's lots of models to choose from, and it's the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, right? So the Purdue model is one that's used a lot, at least in the United States. It was developed by Purdue University and some researchers that basically just try and describe the different security boundaries that exist between business networks and industrial control system and SCADA networks. So basically, if you're interested in security, what you care about, and those security boundaries, by the way, are described as levels. From level 5, where the business network begins, all the way down to level 0, which is where knobs are turning and things are blowing up, potentially. So the most interesting security boundary is between L3 and L4, level 3 and level 4. Now, by the way, I'll pause for a minute to suggest that be careful when you're talking to people within your organization, because I found myself in a heated debate with a routing and switching person, and every time I was talking about L3 and L4, he assumed I was talking about OSI layer 3 and layer 4. So you can imagine, 15 minutes into a conversation when we weren't talking about the same thing at all. But the Purdue model, I'm going to confuse myself. The business network at L4 touches the ICS network starting at L3. So back in the day, the way you would segregate those environments, as you can see, is there was a DMZ in between them. You just simply didn't connect them, right? So the OT network's not connected to anything, so it's protected. And so IT can go and do its thing, and OT can do its thing because it's not connected. Well, that's not the reality of the world we live in anymore. The notion of an air-gapped ICS environment just simply doesn't exist. One example of the importance of understanding how your network is segregated, I was talking to a healthcare client, and I was asking about their biomedical devices, and I said, okay, how do you have the business network separated from biomedical? I was like, oh, every biomedical device is on a separate VLAN. Like, right on, that's good. So, as a part of this assessment, just go ahead and show us the firewall rules that are separating those VLANs to make sure they're being protected properly. And then they said, oh, there's no firewall. I'm like, okay. So you've got them on a separate VLAN, that's good, but you've got unfettered routing and switching going between the two environments. He said, that's right. So that was an important learning experience, I think. So when you talk about how you separate your networks, understanding the difference between an organizational control and an actual technical control that controls traffic is really important. And I'll stop just short of saying that maybe we should start applying the Purdue model within healthcare organizations. However, it's the same bloody problem, isn't it? So those things that I mentioned earlier about the specialized use cases and specialized devices, that can create gaps in support that are kind of interesting. Both industries are highly regulated. Depending on what part of energy you're in, you may or may not have to deal with NERC and FERC, for example. But the FDA has a lot to say on how we network things within healthcare. This is a fairly recent article that I found. Medical devices are the next security nightmare. Which I'm glad I found. I mean, that's an interesting cover, right? Looks great on the slide, but I mean, we were saying that 15 years ago when I actually worked for a hospital system. So I think it should be, they're just getting worse in terms of our security nightmare. And let me describe a specific story that happened. I was working for a hospital system. We had X-ray machines, of course, all over the place, and we got hit by some self-propagating malware. It was a worm of some sort. And we were, monitoring network traffic. We could see the hosts that were infected, and, antivirus wasn't working well against it. And so anyway, we dispatched a desktop person to a specific room. We knew where the traffic was coming from. So we figured out what Ethernet port the host was plugged into, so we knew physically where it was located. So the desktop guy goes out, and he calls me on the radio and said, hey, I'm in that room 16, like you told me. There's no computers in here. I'm like, okay, dude, I'm looking at the traffic. I mean, I can see the traffic. I can see the malware trying to propagate. There's got to be a computer in there somewhere. Like, I'm telling you, it's not. So I asked him, where are you? Like, what unit in the hospital are you in? And he said, radiology. That'll be important in a second. And I said, I don't know. This is getting bad. There's no computer in there, so I'll just ask the network guys to disable the port. Well, of course, all the hospital leadership knew this incident was going on, so the port was disabled. And within a couple minutes, I got a call from the ER director, and he was kind of panicked, and he was like, hi, we're putting the entire hospital on drive-by. Now, drive-by means that the emergency department can't accept new patients. So if there's an ambulance on the way to the hospital, they've got to be diverted to go to some other hospital. So drive-by is not a word you ever want to hear in the context of when you're doing incident response in a hospital. Or Right. True. So I asked him, I was like, that's weird. Why are you going on drive-by? And he's like, well, we only had one x-ray machine and it just went down. It's like, wow, what a coincidence. I just disabled a port in radiology. And I asked him, what room is that x-ray machine in? And he said 16. I'm like, oh, right. That's where my guy is. So then I had to make that decision on, do we bring the device back online and start accepting patients again? Which is good, but we run the risk of potentially infecting other devices on the hospital. So I remember thinking at that time, that's when I started thinking seriously about getting into consulting, because I'm like, man, I'm a computer geek. I did not sign up for this, life and death decision sorts of things. So the gap in support here was that once we got the machine back online and we were accepting patients again, what we realized is that I had a computer expert on one side that, and by the way, it ran XP. It was a number of years ago, though, who could patch the system and remove the malicious software, but because it was a biomedical device, he was not allowed to access the operating system of this device at all. I had a biomedical engineer standing right next to him who knew how to calibrate the helium and do all the crazy things in X-ray machines, but he didn't know how to log into the machine and do anything. So I had the two people that potentially could have solved the problem that couldn't work together because of regulations that prevented that sort of activity from taking place. It was absolutely maddening. I mean, I thought about beating it to death, not the people, but the X-ray machine with a sledgehammer, but as it turns out, they cost several $1 million, and that was frowned upon. So how do you fix those gaps in support? And I think the oil clients I'm working with are getting pretty good at bridging the gaps between OT and IT. And my suggestion here to everybody in the room is that the similar gaps that exist between IT and biomedical engineering can probably be solved in very, very similar ways. And I mentioned earlier about the myth of the DMZ between L3 and L4, the evolving threat landscape. In oil and gas, you folks probably already know there's a lot of talk about, cloud-based SCADA systems, which 10 years ago, no one would have ever said that out loud and expect to be taken seriously. Now that sort of thing is happening. So, and you've also got the idea that you have local support at every production site for your ICS networks is becoming a myth as well, because, if for a multinational organization, for example, you might have locations all over the planet, and supporting those things on site is very, very inefficient. So in an effort to provide centralized support and supporting these cloud-based systems, you have to connect the ICS network to the business network. Same thing is happening and has been happening in healthcare for quite a while. We're integrating biomedical devices to the electronic health record, to PMPA, that's the patient management, patient accounting system. I remember I mentioned the PDA earlier, the patient delivered analgesic. You click the button and it gives you morphine or whatever. Those things, the sophisticated ones, will send a message to the patient's medical record saying that the patient just gave him or herself a dose of medicine. So now you've got a thing with a network stack sitting in a room with a patient that's talking to the medical record. What? So that's something that we didn't have to deal with 20 years ago. And as I mentioned, physical security, I feel, the healthcare folks, my heart goes out to you, because physical security is really hard in a healthcare environment. You've got people coming in to visit loved ones. You've got nurse stations that have many, many human users that don't have an association with a single workstation, for example. You've just got people going by and quickly logging in. So I haven't figured I haven't figured that part out yet, but I don't have to be right, even, standing up here, but I really want to be a part of the conversation. So a lot of the physical controls that have been very successful in oil and gas are not as easy to implement in a healthcare environment. And I'll give a quick example. Before moving on, I was hired to assess a clinic system in Dallas to figure out if I could gain, first of all, physical access into the, the back office part of the clinic, and then, what information was I able to gather while I was there. And the social engineering, and I'm a terrible social engineer, by the way, but this was easy. My wife's nodding her head, yeah. A terrible liar. So I just walked up and said, "Hi, I'm from IT and I'm here to help." Well, every clinic I went to had at least one or more printers that wasn't working right. So in every case, it's, "Oh, thank goodness you're here. There's this printer that's not working." So I was able to just waltz in under the guise of fixing their printer and plug straight into the network, and off you go. Well, meanwhile, every human being that's in that clinic is very, very busy, treating patients. And so the physical security model in such an environment is completely different. If you try to walk up to, a refinery or a marketing terminal or something like that, physical security is much more serious. So I appreciate that that's a hard problem to solve. So in all cases in those clinics, by the way, just to close this story out, I was able to steal a bunch of their information, but I was sure to fix their printer before I left. So at least, so if you're doing social engineering and you have a pretense of fixing something, try and actually fix it if you can. It'll, make them happy. So I've told some stories and I've pointed out a lot of problems, but I feel like we won't leave here happy if we don't solve some of these problems. So what can we do? So I think we need to revisit how we evaluate our information assets. The decisions need to be made by the business and the clinicians and IT. I think far too often in IT we're expected to come up with our own budgets and then try and sell them to the business. And we don't understand as computer geeks maybe what the challenges the business are having to deal with, and conversely the business probably doesn't understand some of those concepts about the value of those information assets. To put it kind of plainly, I mean, at some point the business approved purchasing and implementing your IT system, whatever system it is, not the whole environment, but if you have a particular application, at some point they decided it was worth spending money on. So somebody somewhere must have decided how much money it was worth spending. Hopefully that wasn't a completely arbitrary process. So I think if, as computer folks, as computer scientists, if we kind of dovetail off of that process and say, well, wait a minute, the reason we implemented it was because of these efficiencies we're going to introduce. How much is it going to cost us if those efficiencies go away? I think changing our vernacular might help out a little bit too. We always talk about information security, and those are the words we use to describe what we do. But I've noticed in oil and gas and in healthcare, safety is sort of a cultural thing that's very, very important to those organizations. And I think they're right. I think if we have the conversation internally with our business units, not in the context of security, but the safety of information. And I know that sounds a little hand-wavy, but that's a concept that they already understand and have understood for a very, very long time. In-house versus third-party, I have this theory that the further away from your organization's core competence information security is, the less efficient it is to implement it. Now, I'm not saying you can't be good at it, because you absolutely can. But an oil and gas or a healthcare company trying to do Infosec, when their core competence are, pulling product out of the ground and fixing sick people, that can be very, very difficult. So always consider, and I know this is shameless because of who I work for, but, consider engaging with third parties to help you out when necessary. It's a lot easier for me to maintain a staff of 2,000 consultants around the world than likely it is for your organizations. The last thought I had on that is, compliance is important. We talked about how heavily regulated these organizations are. But you can be compliant with something and still get attacked and still have an incident. So before blindly implementing technical controls, make sure that you understand your environment. and what your asset management looks like, how many devices you have, and again, make sure you understand which are the really important crown jewels to your organization and which ones are not worth spending as much on. And that's where often engaging with an objective third party can be helpful. So that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you for sitting through that again in the afternoon, right before a happy hour. That QR code is my contact information. Trust me, it's not a malicious URL or anything. Like I said, I don't have to. I'm not convinced. I'm not always right. I just want to be a part of the conversation. So I would love to hear y'all's feedback on what you agreed with, what you disagreed with, and just to help carry the conversation forward. Any comments or questions right now? Marcus, you're closer, so I'll go.